The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Want the real story behind the sound bites and headlines? Let's find the facts. Remember, it's not a conspiracy theory if it's the truth. You are not paranoid or confused. You just need to know.
Welcome, everybody. It's time for another edition of Need to Know, a brand new week. We come to you through the facilities of TKR, recording on Monday mornings to get a fresh start on a brand new week and look back at the previous week oftentimes and find out what we need to highlight and, of course, what you need to know. If you're new to the show, we don't like to tell you what to think. We like to encourage you to think for yourself. And if we can give you a few nuggets that allow you to kickstart that process, for a lack of a better term, it's exactly what we try to do here. Kind of all over the board today. I've got a couple of different topics. I didn't really want to dwell on any one thing. We talked a lot about what was happening in the People's Republic of Minnesota last week on the show, and that is continuing. It's a good place to start because I think it really illustrates a lot of psychological and sociological things that are kind of upside down in our country right now. Without being redundant, because we have a lot of regular listeners to the show, I don't want to recount everything I talked about last week because people are turning in for new content. But I do want to highlight a couple things in case you did not hear last week's show of just the insanity that's going on in Minnesota, where it's like 9 degrees and you've got all these people out all the time trying to obstruct the operations of the immigration enforcement folks, which are a badge-carrying, sworn to uphold the law and do their duty to basically ICE. Is the term, of course, for this particular group of federal law enforcement officials, employees of the Department of Justice. And their job is to find out and serve warrants and make arrests for people in this country illegally who have committed crimes and are criminally now disqualified from being in America. And you're going to hear a lot of rhetoric going on that really this is just, they're just walking around racially profiling innocent people, trying to snatch them up and get them out of the country. And I would be completely dishonest with you and not painting the proper picture if I tell you that 100% of the ICE activity is to round up criminals. But I can tell you that that is the priority of what they're trying to accomplish. And the goal is to make this country safer for you, me, our children, our grandchildren. If you've got felons and you've got people that with long rap sheets running loose on our streets because liberal places, way far left, wacko ideology like Minnesota, and how Minnesota of all places got to be this cesspool of leftist thought and all of this extreme concern for criminal invaders to our country. And we're talking about serious crimes, armed robbers, people guilty of assault, murder, child molestation, rapists. I mean, this is some of the worst of the worst. A lot of these people in our country are gang members. We just had the big incursion, of course, in Venezuela. The man we arrested, Nicolas Maduro, who's now awaiting trial in New York City in this incredible raid. And I want to talk about that a little bit too today on the show. So we got some different directions to go. But Maduro, basically, when Joe Biden threw open the United States borders, and again, I can't blame it on Joe Biden. Joe wasn't making any decisions. He had no authority. You and I had as much input into what the policies of, quote, his administration were than he did. But basically, when those borders were thrown open intentionally to try to bring in as much elements like these from around the world and create instability in our country, and the real goal was to foster this underbelly of society and get these people's social security numbers, so people that were perfectly inclined to not be influenced by preserving and protecting our great country, instead wanting to create criminal enterprises and prey upon the people of the United States of America through a variety of serious crime. Those people that were allowed to just stroll into the country, the Trende de Agua organization from Venezuela, which basically were Maduro's own invasion force of really nefarious, really seriously dangerous criminals that were in his own jails because of the civil disorder in his own country, basically emptied up all those cells and shipped those people to the border to come into the United States to set up all kinds of operations and criminal enterprises in our country that put all of our lives and our livelihoods in jeopardy. And we can rattle off some of the names of people like Laken Riley and Jocelyn Mungary, the young lady in Maryland whose name escapes me at the moment. I don't do this show with notes. But the bottom line is a lot of Americans, particularly women, raped and brutally murdered by these criminal gangs. And I can't imagine losing a loved one that way. But losing a loved one in that manner that had no business being in this country, having either foot on American soil, they were let in here. And I just don't know how you ever come to grips with first, the brutal loss of a loved one in that manner, and second, coming to grips with the fact that they should never have been in this country to start with. So, as usual, I'm getting off on side angles here. But the bottom line is that is the primary mission of ICE right now. There were tens of thousands of criminals in this country that have flocked to these sanctuary cities and states, California, Minnesota, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, all these places that are advertising this is a safe harbor. If you come here, you're going to be get all the rights of an American citizen and more. Because when you're arrested for a crime, chances are you're going to be right back out on the street in no time, because they don't believe in incarceration. They think there's this social, psychological disorder right now in this country that the perpetrators of crimes, they're the victims. They're not the victims, not the people that they rob or beat or rape or even kill. Those people are not the sympathetic characters. It's the poor criminal who's been driven to this kind of life with the hard cards he was dealt or she was dealt. And it's really such a warped, upside down view of things, but it doesn't come from just sheer stupidity. It comes from the desire to use these people once again to make this country unstable. This country really can't be assailed from outside. So the whole strategy has shifted in recent years to try and create as much unrest and discord in the country, so it will implode on its own. We have seen the enemy, and it is us on this continental United States. This is all part of the plan to acquire the most important country in the world, the United States, with all of its resources and all of its residuals and all of its riches. And this is the situation that we're in right now. And Americans stood up last November and said, no, we've had enough of this. The open borders is ridiculous. We've got millions and millions of people in this country that don't belong, and we've got to turn the page. And that is exactly what this president promised to do, and he's executing it now, but running up against all kinds of resistance in all kinds of places. And Minnesota is the primary example right now, because I told you last week on the show, I think the best illustrator of the whole thing, there was a press conference a week ago with the leaders of the Minnesota Educational Association, which is basically a glorified teachers union. All these people that negotiate for teachers and stand up for them, but they've become highly politicized because the education in this country of our children, from kindergarten all the way up into the university system, was hijacked in the late 70s with the creation of the Department of Education, which gave the federal government this big voice in deciding exactly what the curriculum and the criteria for education was. But it was completely a intentional direction to go to try and federalize education, because all these injections of the United States being evil and racist and ill-conceived, it was only going to be a promised land, and the American dream was only going to be available to white males. This is the picture that's been painted for school children now since the late 70s, early 80s, 45 years of indoctrination instead of education, and those fruits have come to bear for this insidious movement to try and change the opinion of young people of their own country. When I went to school back beginning in the 60s, it was a completely different atmosphere. You were taught about the greatness of America. You were taught about what America has provided for the rest of the world. You were proud. I've recounted this for you on the show before. Walking home from school, I can remember in the second or third grade, I was no more than 7, 8 years old. And I can remember having thoughts in my little pointy, undeveloped head of, I can't imagine living in another country. I'm so lucky to be an American. It was like the greatest gift you could have, and that's what was instilled in you at the time. And people argue now, well, that was propaganda as well, because they didn't tell you all of the bad things about the country. But now that's all they want to talk about. They want to talk about, again, we're racist and misogynist and xenophobic, and we're just a horrible group of people. It doesn't matter that we've liberated the continent of Europe twice in world wars and saved all of those pretty much smug liberal leftist asses. They want to tell you how horrible America is, and it's really an unfortunate thing. So with all that being said, this whole Minnesota deal with all of these protesters on the streets trying to inhibit the efforts of the enforcement people, because Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota have become the ultimate cesspool for corruption and for sanctuary to all kinds of just really horrible gang-related perpetrators of serious crime. And these ICE agents, unlike what's being cast and being told to you by the mainstream liberal, completely off their rocker media, who is in league and lockstep with this leftist movement, they're telling you that these people are just cruising the streets and pinning people down and demanding to see proof of citizenship. They're racially profiling everybody. Well, in Minnesota, where a large portion of the population is lily snow white, I really don't see racial profiling being a big undertaking of ICE. They have warrants issued by judges for certain individuals, and unbelievably, so many citizens in the state of Minnesota, particularly around the Minneapolis area, are trying to intentionally interfere with those operations, getting in the way, blocking their cars with their own cars. And these people are not just doing this organically. There have been millions of dollars sent to Minnesota from non-government organizations who have gotten tons of money from the federal government, supposedly for all kinds of other missions. But this is the purpose of all of these organizations that have sprung up that seem to advocate for certain groups of people. And that money, which guess where that money comes from? It comes from me and you and anybody with a job who gets a check, who looks every week at their deductions and sees how much is taken out. And it's taxpayer money that is getting channeled to these non-government organizations who turn around and fund all of these bizarre and ridiculous organizations in a state like Minnesota, who actually pay and train people to be professional antagonists and obstructors. This woman that was shot and killed last week, they're casting her as a Minneapolis mother who was murdered by federal law enforcement officials. This innocent woman had been arrested 6 times in the last 3 years by local police, not by the federal force that's now in Minnesota. Local police had run her in 6 different times for interfering in police investigations and for obstructing, access and for assault and for basically opposing the police force that's left in Minneapolis, which is next to nothing. I think only 4,000 officers when they used to have 35,000. She was also arrested twice in recent times, including in October, for endangering a minor child. Child endangerment, which meant she was doing all this crazy crap that she'd been trained to do. It's been proven she's a certified card-carrying member of one of these organizations that is there to obstruct any kind of law enforcement. But obviously she was conducting those activities with her, young child in the car. So this is not some innocent woman who was just driving around that the federal authorities said, hey, let's go ahead and shoot her in the head and make a statement. This was a woman who literally rammed with her car an ICE agent, and he got up as she backed up again, not knowing what her intention was. This time she might have been going to finish him off with her vehicle. He went ahead and shot into the car, and tragically, her life was lost. But she was not an innocent bystander. These people are on call. They've got eyes all over the city. Anytime they see any kind of ICE operation going to look for and serve a warrant on one of these wanted criminals that need to be deported from this country, they show up in mass to get in the way and obstruct and blow their whistles to warn people to run for your life because you're in great jeopardy, and to lay on their horns and to actually block traffic and block ICE agents' access. It's not an organic movement. This is organized mayhem to cause problems for your federal law enforcement officials. And all of us grew up with respect for police and knowing that if you tried to involve yourself or obstruct a local police officer in any way, you were going to be subject to arrest. It's illegal. You can't do that. They're calling this peaceful protesting. It is not peaceful protesting to directly interfere with a law enforcement officer. Not to mention the fact that it's a federal crime. It's in the Constitution. You do not interfere with federal law enforcement. It is not permitted, and it is a crime, and every one of these people should be handcuffed and hauled off to jail and sentenced harshly for this kind of activity. You don't it goes against everything we've ever been taught and everything we know, that you don't interfere directly with law enforcement. So that's all still going on in Minnesota. It's getting worse and worse by the day. The leadership keeps the mayor and the governor keep coming up with incendiary statements that we've got to fight for our homeland and these people are intruders, and if they leave, we're back to a peaceful environment. Yes, with tons of criminals littered around who they're referring to as their fellow Minnesotans and their neighbors. This just in, folks, they're not your neighbors. They're not fellow Minnesotans. The people being sought in Minneapolis are convicted criminals that have been let back out on the street in these liberal sanctuary cities, and they need to be arrested and they need to be deported for public safety and for the fact that you don't need this internal force in your country of a criminal element to try to create instability. It's just common sense. And the point that I made last week to illustrate it, the Minnesota Education Association, a liberal teachers union who is way left by philosophy and is teaching kids this stuff, this BS every day about how evil and racist and how their country is just a terrible force for evil and I want to say everything that's bad. But the bottom line is they call a press conference last week threatening ICE that this is not going to stand. We've got tons of kids absent from school today because they're terrified to leave their homes. I guess they're referring to people, again, in the country illegally. But these are children that are occupying seats that and taking away educational opportunities from American children because you have to teach now in 4 or 5 different languages. It definitely corrupts the education process for our American kids. But here's the thing. They're threatening ICE last week in this press conference because of an incident that happened on a campus about 3 weeks ago where a convicted, and this is so rich, it's unbelievable, a convicted child molester and a guy guilty of assault with multiple warrants was running from ICE in his car at full speed, a high-speed chase through the city of Minneapolis, which is dangerous on its own merits. Of course, ICE gets the blame for that, for pursuing this guy, who they're holding a warrant signed by a judge for his arrest. ICE is endangering all the citizens of Minneapolis because of this guy being on the run, and they're chasing and pursuing him. He drives onto I think it was a middle school campus, gets out of his car, runs onto the school grounds, pursued, of course, by ICE. They didn't set up operations there. They're chasing a felon who there's a signed warrant for his arrest. He enters the school grounds, and the interpretation of the Education Association is ICE is scaring to death and endangering all the employees and students on these campuses to the point now where they don't even want to come back. It's all ICE's fault. It's not the guy with the warrants who's actually been convicted of child molestation. He's not the danger. It's law enforcement trying to get him when he's the one who led him onto the campus. And that's the way upside down they're looking at it. That's the way that they're trying to build their justification for all of their interference and all of the nonsense you see going on in Minnesota. I'll segue to that from talking about true peaceful protest and true justified civil disobedience, because today is January 19th, the first Monday following the birthday week, which was actually last week on the 15th, January 15th, 1929, the birth of one of the greatest American iconic heroes, and people will cast doubt on that and bring you a lot of different versions. But I can tell you, for me personally, growing up in that era as a young child, Martin Luther King, who's today is the official Martin Luther King Day, one of the most significant, iconic Americans to ever live in this country, because Martin Luther King saw true injustice in the fact that, especially in the Deep South, but don't limit yourself to the South. when segregation was ordered for schools in the late 60s. The biggest riots, the biggest hoopla was in Massachusetts, particularly around Boston. So this is not a situation owned by the South. But Martin Luther King, of course, we know he was born in 1929. He was the son of a Baptist minister. He became a Baptist minister in his own right at a very young age, became the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in downtown Atlanta, and became the most significant giant for civil rights in the history of this country, because he saw wrongs to a group of people in our country, the African American black individuals who were still being heavily discriminated against, which is a stain on our country. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that America has had a perfect history. It has certainly not. There have been terrible lapses in judgment and no moral leadership from the people who should have stepped in many decades before and fixed so much of that injustice. And Martin Luther King really stood up at great personal danger, knowing that he was doing the right thing, that he was being guided by the providence of God. And some of the most amazing highlights. I as a person who doesn't get to do it very often, but loves public speaking, there's nothing like the command of an audience that's riveted to your every word. And this guy wrote the book on that. This guy was one of the great orators, and so one of the great heroes for me, a guy who's always liked to make a lot of noise. But Martin Luther King could just own an audience, and I was too young and I didn't have the opportunity, of course, back in those days. I would have loved to go back in a time machine and be at the 1963 March on Washington, where he gave the famous "I Have a Dream" speech that had probably the greatest line that defines what every human being should aspire to do: not to judge a person by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And those words, since I was a small child, has resonated for me, because if you have any kind of functioning brain, any kind of sense of decency and morality, if you listen to those words, judge a person not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And it's probably one of the proudest accomplishments of my lifetime. I have adhered to that 1,000%. I want to get to know somebody. I want to get to know who they are. I don't care my positive or negative judgment, depending on, and if it's a negative judgment, all that means is it's probably not someone that I'm going to have great regard or personal appreciation of. But that is not based on what you look like. It's based on who you are. And some of the greatest people that I've met, if I would making flash judgments on what their appearance was or the first statements that come out of their mouth, I would have been making a terrible mistake. So some of the closest associations I have right now comes from that speech, because that is the most powerful sentence, I think, from my personal standpoint, that I've ever been impacted by. Not by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. I have a dream today that one day my children will be in a country, and he follows up with those words. And it was just an amazing, go back on YouTube and watch that speech. It just gives you chills, how the command of the audience, the inflection of his voice, just an unbelievable orator. Absolutely. The other was right here in Birmingham when he was arrested for civil disobedience, basically ordered by Birmingham authorities to vacate. And I don't remember the particular cause that time, but it was some striking employees that later on in Memphis would cost him his life in a similar situation. But Dr. King was actually arrested here in Birmingham and sat down and didn't just feel sorry for himself. He wrote an extraordinary 3-page document that is now known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he talks about the moral responsibility he has to stand up despite his own personal putting himself in danger. And I got a little something in my throat. I apologize. And he's talking about, the moral responsibility to sometimes civil disobedience is required to get people to pay attention to what's happening. I really apologize here. I've got a bad frog in my throat. Anyway, the bottom line is go back and read. You can Google it, the letter from the Birmingham jail, because he lays out the case for his entire life's mission, and it's just extraordinary. And of course, his life was cut short on April 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, just kind of off downtown. I lived in Memphis for a while. I endeavored to visit that spot a couple of times and stand there, and you can look up at the balcony where he was standing outside waiting for his cohorts to get organized so they could go to dinner, and was shot from across the street. There's still so much information on that particular heinous crime that's not come to light. And it's really something that I am ashamed about our country, that we can't, on a government that's of the people, by the people, for the people, that we still have to have secrets withheld from us, because there's just a lot more to that story than James Earl Ray, who was a career criminal, but was just a petty criminal. He was like a shoplifter, and I think he had like an armed robbery at some point of like a gas station. This guy was just a third degree kind of guy. And for him to be the patsy that is given the designation as Martin Luther King's assassin, I still have big questions about that. And King was ruffling so many feathers in this country, and poking and prodding at so many institutions. The whole nature of his demise, to me, is still one of the great unsolved and completely covered up mysteries. And it really bothers me as an American that somebody can't step up and say, okay, we are going to open up the files and let you all know everything we know about the Martin Luther King assassination. So a terrible day for America, April 4th. He was in Memphis marching with a bunch of sanitation workers who were on strike. And he had made a speech just the night before, which is chilling. Go back and listen to that. And the audio quality is not very good because it looked like it was in some kind of, Lions Club or some really small venue. But he said, I fear no man. I'm committed to this work. And he said, and I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen a country where everybody has equal opportunities. And he says, I may not get there with you, but I know it's coming. And so he kind of had a premonition of his own time being up, and it's just a tragic story. So you want to talk about peaceful protesting? He was standing up for other Americans. He was not standing up for the criminal element and people that should not be in this country. In Minnesota especially, we flew in almost 200,000 Somalians, relocated them, colonized them in Minnesota, made them a gigantic voting bloc where they've got Tlaib in Congress, who is so anti-American. She just, from every pore of her skin, pours hatred for this country. And she's a congresswoman. She was planted there with this intentional colonization of a country that's so corrupt and so backward that these people have come here now and pulled off an $18 billion fraud, which is another reason we've got federal officials in Minnesota now poring over trying to figure out where your money went, that's been literally stolen with the institution of fake hospitals and fake daycares. And they're billing the government for millions of dollars. It's one of the biggest frauds in the history of our country. And it just spells out the fact that there's so many people here that are not part of the American story, that are not living the American dream, unless the American dream has a new chapter that I wasn't familiar with, how to steal from fellow Americans. This is just a hideous and terrible situation. I wanted to mention real quick, we're running out of time. Venezuela, I saw an extraordinary piece this week that you can find. Carolyn Levitt, who's the press secretary, only 28 years old, and what a remarkable young woman she is. The press gives it to her, and boy, she gives it right back with a punch. She should have been a UFC female fighter because she is unbelievable. But she published an interview, and I don't know where she got it. Some foreign journalist had actually interviewed one of the security people at that raid that night by the American Army Delta Force. And he was describing the circumstances, how helicopters hovered overhead. All of a sudden, there were about 25 Americans shimmy down to the ground level. There was just a token force. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, Venezuela time. There was a token security force of Cuban soldiers. And that the reason they're Cubans is because the Cubans were providing security for Maduro because Maduro had been supplying them with oil for the last bunch of years. So the Cuban force is accosted by 25 elite American troops, and the alarm goes out for all of the other forces in the barracks there, all the Cuban forces, to immediately report to the conflict zone. And he said they had about 200 soldiers that were rousted up in the middle of the night, but actually had gotten up there. And by the time they walked into the situation, the 35 or 40 forces that were already on guard had been pretty much wiped out by this 25-man force of Americans, because he said, I've never walked into a situation. I don't know what kind of, this is his words, I don't know what kind of weapons these were, but they were firing in such rapidity that the weaponry we had was so inferior, we had no chance. But now we had a 5-to-1 advantage in manpower. And he described the deployment of some kind of weapon, some kind of percussion weapon that was fired into the mass of oncoming soldiers that kind of made an explosion, but it was like a sonic thing. It was like something to, all of a sudden you said, you were knocked to the ground by the force of this percussion like sound weapon that just rocked your head. It made your head feel like it had just exploded. He said you realized right away your nose was bleeding profusely. You were bleeding out of your ears. You were totally disoriented. So basically, we had superior tactics and superior weaponry to a force of 25 elite soldiers, completely dismantled over 200 defenders of Maduro. And the operation from there was pretty smooth because the Delta Force entered the presidential quarters or wherever he was staying. We had great intelligence on the ground to find out exactly what his routine was, where he would exactly be. They went and in no time had him and his wife, who was also an indicted felon, indicted back in 2020. So they've been fugitives from justice. This guy was the president of Venezuela, but it was with tainted elections. They had stolen power. What they really were the leader of one of the biggest drug cartels and terrorist organizations in our hemisphere. And from 1823, when James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine and said, we're not going to have any of this in our part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere. Anybody up to no good that's threatening the United States, we have every right to go and defend ourselves and our people. And that's just what this group did with the direction of our president. That's what true leadership is. And for all these people in Congress, we declared war on Venezuela and Donald Trump violated the law by not getting a declaration of war from Congress. If he had gone to Congress and even suggested that this was going to be done, it would have been completely a failure and we would have lost American lives. Guess how many American lives we lost in this operation? 0. One less than one. Every single soldier on the ground And every single pilot who ran the support missions to knock out power in Caracas to facilitate this operation, every single one of them came back unscathed, unhurt, and very much alive. So if you go to Congress and go through those channels, when it was not an official declaration of war, it was authorized by the Monroe Doctrine, which has been in place now for however many years, 205 years or whatever, since 1823. It's just a remarkable operation, and it made our hemisphere safer because we took away not only a leading terrorist and drug czar from a neighboring country in our neck of the woods, but also severely inhibited Cuban interaction. Another place that we need to address that's way too close to home here, that has been allowed to fester for decades after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1963. Cuba's next on the list, but they're in such economic straits, they may take care of themselves because their biggest economic partner, Venezuela, has now been neutralized. But even more importantly than that, China and Russia have been very active in Venezuela. Venezuela's been providing them with oil, and they've been providing them with all kinds of technology. This country was a threat right on our doorstep, and it's been taken care of now. And the message has been sent to the world. This interview was eye-opening from the standpoint that this message to the world, after what Trump and the U.S. military did to wipe out the Iranian nuclear initiative with the most audacious mission ever, flying nonstop all the way to Iran, entering airspace undetected and completely wiping out that nuclear infrastructure that they've been building for 20 years and we're on the verge of succeeding. This is what real leadership is. This is protecting you and your children and your children's children for decades and hopefully a century to come. And this is the kind of bold leadership that this country needs to keep displaying, because believe me, everybody in the world is paying a lot of attention to the capabilities of this country and what we can do if we set our mind to it, to be a force for good and stability to the rest of the country. The Middle East is on the verge of ending this, the completely never stopping constant conflict in that region that has resulted in the deaths of millions of people. The world is a lot more stable now, and we're just getting started. Don't ever doubt the greatness of your country. It is, and anybody who is talking that nonsense about America being corrupt and evil and not a force for good in the world, being a imperialistic, negative force. It's your responsibility as a citizen to tell that person that they're full of what, and stand up for your country if that's what you truly believe, like I do. My radio partner Terry Quillian's famous for, on an airplane, if somebody's running their mouth and saying a bunch of things, she'll say, "Excuse me," and she will step up for your country. And I like to think that in that circumstance, I'd do the same thing. So that's the kind of Americans we need to be: proactive and a force for good in this world and stability. And that's the message today on Need to Know. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We will be talking about another interesting spot next week. I want to tell you all about what's happening with Greenland. Have you ever given a thought ever to the country, the island of Greenland? I'll tell you all about it next week right here on Need to Know.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio.